In this conversation, you talked about how people are sort of fascinated with risk. I am as well, because I've heard a lot of career advice around like when you should take risks in your careers. So I'm kind of curious, like, what's your take on like like how do you think about risk tolerance as it relates to one's career, and when should you take risk in your career? And maybe you kind of already touched on this about looking at your constraints and deciding based on that.
Yeah, I think there is a real fascination. I think, you know, the general, how do I call it? The common wisdom, or I think in French called the common wisdom. I don't know how it is in English. But it is about like taking risks while you're younger, right?
Yeah.
Like everyone is like, oh yeah, you're young, you can afford it. Like, because you can afford it, you should probably do it now, because maybe later you won't be able to, right? In practice, though, I do think it kind of depends on the person's risk tolerance levels. And risk tolerance, I think there's, you know, being more risk tolerant is not necessarily better. I think there is like this, you know, founders are the best. Not true. Honestly, I've done a bit of both, and the jury's still out. what's better? But I think like identifying one's constraints is where I would actually start. You don't want to blame yourself. You don't want to be in a position where you're being dictated by what society does, because ultimately we're very mimicry driven individuals. Like, we are super mimicry driven. We like to say, this is how I think about the world and whatnot. Most of the time you're just thinking whatever like the 5 people you spend most time with are thinking. And whether that's, you know, starting a company or not, or whether that's what's happening in, I don't know, in the economy, it's all driven by that in the end. So I think understanding one's honest constraints and being honest with yourself is where I would start. Once you identify your own constraints, then it's a matter of like, what will get you excited to wake up in the morning? And if you do something that keeps you really excited every day, you're stretching, you're growing, you're excited. Whether that's starting a company or working somewhere, actually doesn't really matter. That's how I would think about it. I think I have to call it out, because I find that, at least in the founder space, like the founders that I hang out with, I think there is a little bit of, on the outside, there's this perception that you have to take a lot of risk all the time. In reality, not everyone can afford it, and I think we should be open to that as a society, as opposed to like trying to drive everyone down the same funnel.
Yeah.